Hi guys, today we're going to be taking a look at an article called The Lost Ship. So before we start reading, I would invite you to take a look at some of the text features that we see here, like the pictures, titles. As we scroll, we see some captions and other pictures, some text boxes. So just take a look at those headings and subheadings and bolded words for a moment and make some predictions about what you think this story might be about. Go ahead and pause here. All right, so this particular text is a narrative nonfiction, which means that it's a true story, but it's written in a little bit of a narrative format, meaning it tells a story. And this one is called The Lost Ship. It's a World War II ship destroyed at sea, a captain blamed for the tragedy, and a middle schooler's quest to change history. And this was written by Kristen Lewis. So we'll go ahead and start at the beginning here. On July 29th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis made its way through the warm waters of the South Pacific Ocean. Hundreds of miles from land and wrapped in darkness, the ship was a mere whisper of a shadow on an endless sea. The night was very hot. Some of the crewmen had brought their bedding above deck to sleep outside. In spite of the heat, the mood was hopeful. After nearly 6 years of bloodshed, World War II seemed to be ending. Already, Adolf Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe had ended with Germany's defeat. It was only a matter of time before the war with Japan ended too, and everyone could go home. But the Indianapolis would never go home. Just before 11 p.m., Captain Charles McVay III retired to his cabin. McVay was proud to be the captain of the USS Indianapolis. The ship was part of the American Navy. It was about the length of 2 football fields, heavily armed with very fast. Throughout the war, the ship had carried supplies, weapons, planes, and troops across the Pacific Ocean. The ship had seen many battles, and it had survived them all. In fact, the Indianapolis had just completed a mission and was now sailing away from the fighting. Captain McVay thought their route was safe. Things were very quiet. Commodore James Carter had told McVay before they set sail, "There's nothing to worry about." It would turn out that this was not correct. As the crew went about their work, or got some rest, or wrote letters home, a Japanese submarine spotted the Indianapolis and fired. 2 torpedoes shot through the water. They hit the Indianapolis. Fires broke out. Water gushed into the ship. The force of the blast knocked McVay out of bed. He got to his feet and raced to the bridge. For the next 8 minutes, he and the crew focused on assessing the damage and trying to send a distress message. But when it became clear the Indianapolis was doomed, McVay gave the orders: abandon ship. A few minutes later, a giant wave pushed him into the sea. It took 12 minutes for the ship to sink. Nearly 900 of the 1,200 men on the ship made it into the water alive. Captain McVay survived too. The survivors drifted through the ocean for the next 5 days. 12-foot waves tossed them around. They were very hungry and thirsty. Some began drinking seawater in desperation, only to throw it up. Others became delirious and insisted that there were fresh water and ice cream waiting for them on the sunken ship. They swam down and were never seen again. Meanwhile, packs of hungry sharks circled the men. The sharks picked them off one by one. Help finally arrived, but only 316 survivors remained. So at this point, I would invite you to pause this video and make sure that you've annotated the text. Remember, you can annotate words you don't know. You can write paraphrases of what's happening. You can mark parts that surprise you or that you have connections to. All right, we're going to continue on with the subheading, The Trial. Japan announced it would surrender 12 days after the survivors were rescued. But as the world celebrated the end of the war, the families of the men lost on the Indianapolis grieved. They wanted to know how such a terrible thing could have happened in the last days of the war. They wanted to know if it could have been prevented. They wanted to know who was to blame. The Navy came up with an answer: Captain McVeigh. He was put on trial by the military during the trial, he was put on trial by the military. During the trial, the Navy accused McVeigh of putting the ship in unnecessary danger. They said he should have zigzagged. This means following a crooked path through the water. The Navy claimed it would have stopped enemy torpedoes from hitting the Indianapolis. After a 2-week trial, McVeigh was found guilty. This decision did nothing to bring back the men who had been lost, but it destroyed McVeigh's life. He was haunted by the loss of his men and his ship until his death in 1968. That might have been the end of the story of the Indianapolis, but it was only the beginning. Go ahead and pause here and annotate your text. All right, now we're going to read a school project. In 1996, 50 years after the sinking of the Indianapolis, 11-year-old Hunter Scott was watching a movie at his home in Florida. The movie was called Jaws. Hunter was riveted by the story of a ferocious shark terrorizing a town, but it wasn't the shark that really caught Hunter's attention. It was a short speech by one of the characters about a ship. The ship was called the Indianapolis. Hunter asked his dad if the story of the Indianapolis, a ship whose crew had met a terrible fate after being torpedoed, was true. His dad said it was. Hunter decided to make the ship the topic of his 6th grade history fair project. The theme was triumph and tragedy. Hunter started searching for information. He searched the library and put an ad in the local Navy newspaper. Eventually, he connected with a survivor from the Indianapolis named Maurice Glenn Bell. Pause here and annotate. A middle schooler's mission. Hunter traveled to Mobile, Alabama to interview Bell in his home. During their conversation, Bell told Hunter about his final minutes on the Indianapolis. He showed Hunter his Purple Heart, which is a special military award given to those hurt in combat. Bell also gave Hunter a list of survivors who were still alive. There were 154 of them. Hunter began writing to them. The response was beyond anything Hunter could have imagined. The survivors, most of whom were in their 70s and 80s, sent Hunter photographs and letters. They wrote about friends they'd lost. They described the long days and nights wondering if rescue would ever come. Some spoke for the first time in decades about what they had gone through. But as the stories poured in, a larger story began to take shape. The survivors described McVeigh as a leader, a man of honor and integrity, a man they respected. They said that McVeigh had been unfairly blamed for what had happened to them on that tragic night so long ago. After hearing these stories, Hunter realized that his project would be about a lot more than winning the history fair. His project would be a mission to restore a good man's name, to change history. Go ahead and pause and annotate. What really happened? Hunter eventually learned that the tragedy of the Indianapolis could not be blamed on one man. It was the result of a series of mistakes, oversights, and bad luck. For example, before Captain McVeigh set sail, he asked for an escort ship for protection, but he was told this wasn't necessary. By then, most of the war activity was far from where Indianapolis would be sailing, and on the day of sinking, McVeigh had ordered the Indianapolis to travel at half speed to save fuel. This was a common practice at the time. Captain McVeigh didn't know that at least 4 enemy submarines were in the area. In fact, one had sunk another U.S. ship only days earlier, but this important information was never given to him. Hunter had questions. If he had known, might McVeigh have increased the ship's speed? Might he have changed the route? Might he have insisted on an escort? Even worse, no one noticed when the Indianapolis did not arrive at its destination of an island in the Philippines called Leyte. As hundreds of men fought for their lives in the water, no one even realized they were missing. In fact, they were discovered by accident. A pilot happened to spot spilled fuel from the ship. Bell and many other survivors told Hunter the trial was a sham. Important information had been left out. The captain of the Japanese submarine, Moshitsuru Hashimoto, was brought in to testify. He would later say his words had been mistranslated in a way that made McVeigh seem guilty of causing the disaster. But Hashimoto insisted that the ship was doomed the moment his submarine spotted it. It was also questionable whether McVeigh should have zigzagged the Indianapolis. It was debated whether zigzagging actually worked. You could easily zigzag to avoid one torpedo and sail into another. What's more, as far as McVeigh knew, the route was relatively safe and had no reason to zigzag. The trial was the worst thing the Navy could have done, Bell told Hunter. It dishonored the captain and the crew. For decades, the survivors had been trying to exonerate their captain. They were not successful. They were frustrated and angry. During the war, more than 300 captains lost their ships. Only McVeigh was put on trial. Could a middle schooler make the world listen at last? Go ahead and pause and annotate here. A new mission. In 1997, Hunter wrote to President Clinton. He also wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, John Dalton. He asked for McVeigh to be cleared of all wrongdoing. The answer he received was no. But Hunter would not Hunter would not be discouraged. Giving up never crossed my mind, Hunter says. I just felt this was the right thing to do, and that other people would also see it was the right thing to do. Luckily, a congressperson in Hunter's hometown of Pensacola heard about Hunter's project and decided to display it in his office. A story appeared in a local newspaper. Before long, it had been picked up by the national press. Boys' School Project aims to revise history, read one headline. Go ahead and pause and annotate. Powerful testimony. For the next 4 years, the Indianapolis dominated Hunter's life. Hunter filled binders with notes. He created detailed timelines. There was no question he couldn't answer. There was no detail he missed. News crews followed him around at school. It seemed like every other weekend he was traveling for an interview. He gave a speech at the Indianapolis Survivors Annual Reunion. He marched with them in a parade. He even uncovered new details that had not been presented at McVeigh's trial. One detail was that before the Indianapolis sank, its distress calls had been received by at least 3 people, but none of them responded to these calls. Finally, 2 members of Congress took up Hunter's cause. They invited Hunter to Washington, D.C. They also invited survivors and representatives from the Navy. Hunter gave a powerful testimony. Hashimoto, by then 90 years old and living as a Shinto priest in Japan, even sent a personal letter to one senator who had heard Hunter's testimony. I have met many of your brave men who survived the sinking of the Indianapolis, Hashimoto wrote. I would like to join them in urging that your national legislator clear their captain's name. Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war and its consequences. Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction. Pause and annotate. All right, we're going to go on to this last section called Honor Restored. In 2001, Hunter, then 16, was fishing with his father. He received the phone call that he'd been waiting for. McVeigh's name had been cleared. It had been 5 years since Hunter watched Jaws. The movie had started it all. His family had spent a small fortune on Hunter's travels. Hunter had given up after-school activities. He had given up time with friends. And yet Hunter will tell you that his sacrifice was nothing compared with what Captain McVeigh and the crew of the Indianapolis suffered. Today, Hunter is a pilot in the U.S. Navy. It was not a career he imagined for himself when he started his project all those years ago, but the time he spent with the survivors changed him. What those men sacrificed, the courage and honor they showed, he says, I joined the Navy for them. Go ahead and pause and annotate here. All right, so one of the things that we're really working on this week is summarizing a text. So I want you to think about each section and what you learned from those sections and how would you put that all together into a summary of this particular text. Good luck.